So, why we're here today, the first session this morning is I'm going to give you a product update. Where are we at with the product set? Specifically, we are on the verge of releasing Synergy version 11, so I'm going to be talking a lot about what's in version 11 and what that's about primarily, and giving you some information about the primary features and some of the smaller features and what to look out for. Version 11 is currently in beta, so if you see anything here that you're interested in, most of the stuff I'm going to be talking about is in the current beta that's available, I think, on all platforms. There are one or two features that will be in the final version 11 release that we're still working on, and I think they're noted later in the presentation. So the primary goals of version 11 are the ones that we can see at the top here: simplified licensing, enhanced security, improved resilience, and better developer experience were the four things that at a high level we kind of targeted for version 11. And there are many, many other smaller scope improvements throughout. Some of the examples are listed on the bullets there at the bottom of the slide. And we'll talk about some of these things in turn as we go through. So the first of the major goals is simplified licensing. And what's happening in Synergy version 11 is we're introducing formal support for something called Rev 11 licensing. The Rev 11 licensing and Synergy version 11, the 11 is kind of a coincidence. They don't necessarily go together. Rev 11 licensing is included in Synergy version 11, but it is also available for Synergy version 10 and Synergy version 9. I'm not going to talk in great detail about what it is right now because I do have a whole separate session on this later in the day. But essentially, in the 30,000 foot view, it's a simplified process for distributing and managing your product license keys on most of our platforms apart from the OpenVMS platform. So what essentially happens is your license manager now has the ability and will in fact communicate with our Synergy licensing web service up in the cloud, and that is a new mechanism for obtaining, downloading, and installing license keys. And the ultimate goal is to simplify your life in terms of not having to reinstall annual keys for subscriptions and not having to reinstall keys to change the number of users and things like that. We'll talk a lot more detail about it later on. There's also a whole new feature in License Manager, which is fuzzy matching. And what that's all about is essentially it's the ability to run multiple versions of the product using a single license key. So essentially, if you have a Synergy version 11 license and you have a current ALM or subscription agreement with us, then you can use that version 11 license to run any version of the Synergy products. So you don't necessarily have to have version 9 licenses and version 10 licenses and version 11 licenses to run different parts of your system or different applications. The fact that you've got a Synergy 11 license and you've got a current agreement with us and you have the right to use that, you also have the right to use all those other versions, and that key will enable that. As I mentioned, this is available on Windows, Linux, and Unix, and we'll be going into much more detail later in the day. Another goal of Synergy 11 was enhanced security. Pretty much every version we're looking at security and what we need to do to keep up to date. So in this Synergy version 11, we've got access to enhanced encryption technologies. So this affects all of our products that have the ability to do encryption, HTTP, XF Server and XF Server Plus, the ODBC and SQL connection products, anywhere that you can apply encryption, and indeed the data encrypt and data decrypt routines can all benefit from this. Essentially, in Synergy version 11, we are introducing support for OpenSSL 1.1.1, and that version of OpenSSL is the current long-term support release from OpenSSL and will be supported through September 11, 2023. You should note that, very importantly, a lot of us are using some flavor of OpenSSL 1.0 something right now, and that version ceases to be supported at the end of this year. So if you are still using older versions of OpenSSL 1.0, then you really need to look at upgrading. And to do that, you might need to get onto a higher version of Synergy. Synergy 11 will also default wherever possible to using TLS 1.2. So previous versions defaulted to TLS 1.1, and we will try and use TLS 1.3 wherever possible. So we're really trying to ramp up and use those higher encryption protocols whenever they're available. If you are doing encryption over your XF Server connections or XF Server Plus or any of those capabilities, and if you are using TLS 1.0, that is pretty insecure these days, and it is no longer supported in Synergy version 11. If you want to use the older and somewhat insecure 1.1, you might have a little bit of work to do to force the system to downgrade to those protocols, because it's going to try and do at least 1.2 or higher. Another goal is improved resilience. We have got a whole slew of improvements coming in this area and in this regard, some of which are there in the product today, some of which are still coming later before the final 11.1 release, and some of which are after 11.1. We're looking to improve ISAM reliability and performance. Everything we're talking about in this regard is trying to find ways of moving closer to 24/7 computing, or 24/7 365 computing. This is a multi-phase project starting with 11.1, introducing some core functionality. In the current beta, part of this has been released. The bit that's in the current beta is we've now introduced significant ISUtil performance enhancements. And what that means is that you can rebuild file indexes approximately 10 times faster than in the previous versions. So re-indexing of ISAM files, either for corruption reasons or simply for performance tuning reasons, is significantly faster than it ever was. And that's going to be a cornerstone for building many more things as we come along. And again, I'll get into a little bit more detail later on. Coming next, still in the 11.1 beta, so before final release, we're going to be introducing a new ISUtil option that will allow you to re-index files that are currently in use. So a big stumbling block right now is you can't rebuild a file because someone's using it. And that's one of the big 24/7 issues. So you will be able to re-index while the file is in use. And we will also be introducing a subroutine to let you re-index files on the fly. So no longer does it have to be a system administrator command line type thing or spawning command prompts. You can actually design software to re-index files while they're in use, on demand, essentially. And there will be additional features in subsequent releases, which I will talk about later on. Another goal of Synergy 11 was better developer experience. Tons and tons and tons of little individual things in Visual Studio. If you install the version 11 version of the Synergy DBL integration for Visual Studio, I'm pretty confident you will find it a much more pleasant experience. It's certainly resolved. And I keep up to date with all the builds. And as soon as I went to the version 11.1, a lot of things just started working so much better. So significant work has been done in the area of finding references. Also, if you're working with very large solutions, we're seeing some major improvement in load times for large solutions with large numbers of projects. That was really one of the big pain points in Visual Studio. We're also working on improvements specifically in traditional Synergy. One of the big pain points right now is that if a subroutine in an ELB gets rebuilt, then everything that links against that ELB gets rebuilt as well. And we're working on a mechanism to prevent that happening and stop programs getting relinked unless the signatures change, because that's really the only time you need to relink anything. So there's some major improvements coming in that area as well. We've introduced support for Visual Studio 2019, and again, I do have a Visual Studio session later in the day, so I'm not going to talk about that one in too much more detail. Let's look at some of the individual changes. Some of these, I'm going to fly past some of these fairly quickly because some of them are fairly small things, but important from a development point of view. In traditional Synergy, we've had the string class for quite a while, and over previous versions, we've gradually added more to it. It was a fairly major subset of the .NET string class originally. It's getting closer now. We've added more and more functionality over the years. And again, these are just some of the things we've added to the string class in traditional in 11. So string concatenation, string insert, string is null or empty, string remove, and string trim are all new things that have been either added or enhanced. There's also been some work done in the compiler so that if you still do string equals string plus string plus string plus string, which is a pretty slow operation, under the hood, the compiler optimizes that to use string.concat, which is significantly faster. So you'll see if you have got a lot of string arithmetic going on in your programs, you may see a noticeable difference there. Another difference is we've had support for extension methods in the Synergy.NET product for a while. We now support extension methods in the traditional Synergy world. Again, if you're not familiar, an extension method is your way of taking a class that someone else has defined and enhancing it with your own custom stuff without having necessarily access to the source code. So we now have support for extension methods in traditional Synergy. So there's an example of using an extension method to extend the string class to have a method called isPhoneNumber that returns a Boolean if the string represents a phone number. Another thing we've done in traditional Synergy, again, it's been fully working in .NET for a while. We've had the ternary operator available in Synergy for quite some time, but it was a little flaky. It's now been fully supported and fully works in traditional Synergy. So the ternary operator, if you're not familiar with it, is a way of basically evaluating an expression, and if that expression evaluates to true, then the expression has this value. If it evaluates to false, it has this value. So it's a way of doing a kind of if-then-else kind of processing in line, essentially. There's also a new operator being added in traditional Synergy. Again, this one's been in .NET for a little while now. This is the null coalescing operator. So the null coalescing operator, question mark, basically in this example, result will be assigned the value of x unless x is null, in which case the value of y will be assigned. So it's a way of guarding against null references and providing an alternate value if a null reference is present and so on. And again, it's been there in .NET for a while. It's now supported in traditional Synergy as well. There's a second null processing operator, which is the null conditional operator. I believe this is new to both traditional and .NET in Synergy. And this, again, is a way of guarding against null reference operations. So you can see the null operator here. You can see we've got a string.substring reference being used. But if middle name happens to be a value of null, then this would previously cause a null reference operation. So by using the null conditional operator, basically, if the value is null here, it will suppress the null reference and just assign a value of null to the other variable there. We've also done some work in the select class. The where clause, in particular, now has a new method, which is called where.like. This applies to both the where and the no case where. So if you're doing case insensitive where clauses as well, you can now do pattern matching with the like method. And essentially, you specify the variable that you want to search, and you design a pattern that you want to search for. That pattern might be as simple as asterisk, or it might contain things like, %. So % represents 0 or more characters. You can specify any single character. You can specify a set of characters. So in the example here, you can say H followed by O or A, and then followed by T. So that will match hot, hat, and hit. So you get the idea. You can use these various little placeholders to build up the match string that you want, and then filter your select results based on that. And you can escape these values as noted over here. So if you want to use some of these special characters as searches, then you can escape them with a backslash. So there is a new function in Synergy 11 called hatNameOf. This basically allows you to refer to the name of a program element, so the name of a variable, the name of a type, the name of a member. The primary use case here is if you're referring to the name of something in an error message, and that something ever gets refactored, so the actual name of the property that you're referring to gets renamed, for example. If you're using nameOf, then the compiler will insert the name for you. But if you're hard coding the name of something in a string, and then you refactor the thing you're referring to, it doesn't get refactored. So using hatNameOf ensures that you continue to refer to the actual name of something in code, even though it may have been renamed or refactored. We have also now in Synergy the ability to do base 64 encoding. This is present in all of our platforms, but predominantly useful on the traditional Synergy platform because .NET, you've been able to do this in the framework forever. But we have the ability to do base 64 encoding and decoding. So base 64 encoding and decoding is very, very common if you're interacting with web services and things like that. It's essentially a way of encoding a piece of binary data so it doesn't contain binary data, and it's represented as simple alphanumeric data so that you can transfer it over the wire without breaking network protocols and things like that. So base 64 encoding stuff is a very common way of passing data up and down across web services and things like that. So basically there is a new class in Synergy called SynergyX Synergy DE data encoding, and it has 4 methods. Actually, there's a few more than this, different variations on parameters. But to base 64 and from base 64 lets you do base 64 encoding. And then there's a variation on the theme called base 64 URL encoding, which is about base 64 encoding URL information specifically. The characters that are encoded are a little bit different. So you can do both base 64 and base 64 URL encoding with this. We've also got some changes in traditional Synergy, actually on all platforms, to the HTTP API. So we've got 2 new supported methods in the HTTP API. And again, this is really about interacting with web services. And we've now got support in traditional Synergy for doing HTTP patch. So a patch generally in a RESTful web service is a partial update. you send instructions to check, for this customer, change the company name to this value. It's not replacing the whole company record, it's just updating a single property, essentially. So patch is a very efficient way of doing updates and very common in RESTful web services. So now you have access to that from traditional Synergy. We also have support for the HTTP head method. Head isn't frequently used, but every now and again it's really super useful. Essentially what it does is it's like doing a get, but all you get back is the message headers, not the actual message itself. In some cases, if you're about to download a video, for example, and you want to know how big it is, if you do a GET request, it'll actually retrieve the resource. If you do a head request, it will just give you the headers, which includes the content length, so you know how big the thing is you would download. It's one typical example of why you would use a head. Also, more and more, we were finding that HTTP 1.1 has a thing called chunked encoding. So if there's a very large download, HTTP 1.1 servers can choose to break that into multiple packets that come back, or multiple responses, essentially, and we didn't previously have support for that. We were running across it more and more times while trying to interact with third-party web services. So now the API just automatically supports chunked encoding. If it encounters it, it will download all of the individual chunks for you and just hand you the response. Previously, you had to drop down to HTTP 1.0 to prevent the server from using chunked encoding. Also, just brief information, we've done some work in terms of high DPI on Windows, so improving high DPI experience on high DPI monitors. So this impacts both low-level Windows and the UI Toolkit environment. So if you do have Toolkit applications running on Windows, you will see that they look slightly differently under version 11. There's not a massive change. Essentially, we've switched to using the Windows 7 standard, 7 and later mechanism for painting Windows. Previously, we were using the Windows XP mode in Windows for backward compatibility. So things like window borders and the drag bar can look a little bit different when you go to Synergy version 11. If you're doing anything yourself with pixel level stuff, slaving controls into the container window, stuff like that, you might have a little bit of tweaking to do. But other than that, unless you're doing that level of stuff in the DLL API in your code, then you should just notice a slightly improved look and feel, and things should work better on high DPI monitors. XF Server Plus and XF Server now have the ability to have their, and this is basically a Windows change, to export the configuration information for XF Server Plus and XF Server and re-import it again. So one of the things was, if you uninstall Synergy, you lose all of your service settings, essentially. So you can now manually do an export, install your new version and then manually import them again. Or if you're an ISV and you've got standard system setups where you need these 4 server instances defining, you can predefine those in a configuration file, ship them out with your installation, and have your installation automatically generate those services for you. There is a new runtime in Synergy on Windows called DBR XP. Most of you will probably never need to encounter this. There's really one use case, which is if you're still using the old UI Toolkit Composer, there are aspects of Composer that are built with a pretty old version of Delphi, and that old version of Delphi has not been updated to deal with some new things in Windows. So at this point, it has to be run in Windows XP compatibility mode. So you will see a new runtime out there called DBR XP, and its primary use is running Composer. However, if you do have any old software that uses old ActiveX controls that might require Windows XP mode for any reason, then potentially you could make use of that as well. There are some new installers around as well. The installers are all now built with Wix, and you'll see a much more modern user experience. If you've installed our Synergy DBL integration with Visual Studio tools, you'll have seen this style of installer for quite a while. It's now present across all of the product set. If you're doing silent install, so if you're embedding our install within yours, then there are some command line changes. So you'll need to review what the new command line options are and make some fairly small changes to your installation. And just to let you know, we are considering extracting Workbench from the 32-bit installation completely and making it a separate installation. And the primary driving force down there is just the bulk of the SDE32 is Workbench, which is only required on developer systems. It just bloats the size of everything for all the runtime only installs. So not fully decided yet, but we're thinking about that. Synergy 11 future plans anticipated in an upcoming release. So these are some things before 11.1. We are still working on putting a Visual Studio mechanism together for doing order-independent schema loads in repository projects. Right now, Visual Studio does have a repository project, and you can use it to build from and to a schema. But a lot of our customers use individual schema files for every structure, every file, every whatever, and we don't currently have a good way of resolving those things and loading them all together into a repository, so that's being worked on. We are also looking at a way of running XF Server Plus as a standard user level process rather than requiring it to be a root or admin level logging. Some of our customers are kind of insisting that we're not allowed to run anything with admin permissions anymore. So we are reviewing that and hoping to get that out there before 11, the final release. I want to talk to you a little bit about Resilient ISAM. So Resilient ISAM is this thing we're at the beginning of a multi-phase project. So in Synergy 11.1, we've already mentioned we've got way faster index rebuilds, up to 10 times faster. We can now, or will be able to re-index files while the file is in use, and we'll have a new X call to allow us to do that on the fly from software. In subsequent releases, it's still in the version 11 product set, but not 11.1. And these are things that will require a new ISAM revision. So there'll be a new ISAM revision 6.4. So to get these things, you'll have to patch your ISAM files to that new revision level. But we're looking at adding, and I'll talk about each of these things in turn, but a couple of new ISAM file options, resilient and full resilient, some new I/O hooks, a new mechanism for doing bulk initial loads very quickly, so getting data into files very quickly, a mechanism for non-keyed sequential read access, and further select class enhancements. So the resilient option, the idea is if you turn on the resilient option, which will be an option when you create an ISAM file, then it will cause all open and update I/O operations to automatically re-index the file if the index becomes out of sync. So essentially, with resilient ISAM files, they will become self-healing. Okay, so if they detect a problem, they will just do a re-index there and then on the fly. Okay, and there will be a way of suppressing that if you really want to revert back to the old behavior and have an error that you can trap and do something with, like you have today, then there will be a way of falling back to that behavior. But we've got the index rebuild time so quick now that it's realistic to do it just on the fly whenever we detect there's a problem. Okay. For most files. Now, obviously, some of you are going to have massive history files and so on that you might not want to do that on the fly. But bear in mind, it can happen while the file is in use. Okay, so there's a lot of things to consider here. There'll be a new full resilient option. If you turn on full resilient, you'll get resilient, but it will also be that we will ensure that all write I/O operations, so write, stores, and deletes, will be written in a write-through cache mechanism. So for the data partition. So we will flush all data file changes directly through to the disk through any write-through caches. Along with those, we're looking at some new I/O hooks. So there'll be a new pre- and post-open hook. Again, bearing in mind that when you open a channel, it could detect index out of sync and do a resync automatically. So there'll be some new open hooks to let you detect that is happening at file open and potentially suppress it if you don't want it. So you'll have control of all of this stuff throughout. And the new interrupted operation hook, which is essentially it's a hook telling you that the runtime detected an index out of sync and it's about to re-index it. And again, you will have the opportunity to override that and say, no, don't, give me an error instead, I'll deal with it, I'll X-call resync it later or whatever you want to do. So I/O hooks to let you detect the fact that the index is out of sync and we're about to fix it. We're also looking at a new mechanism, basically a new open statement option, bulk initial load. And what this will let you do is bulk load data directly to an ISAM file's data partition, straight to the IS1 file, without doing any I/O to the index at all. So you can load the data file extremely quickly and then do a re-index at the end when it's done, which again is significantly faster. So that will give you a way of putting vast amounts of data into files very quickly and then re-indexing them. And it'll do an automatic re-index as soon as you close the channel and build the new index. Limited use cases, but significant performance improvement. So, things like period end routines, building temporary files and stuff like that is probably the typical scenario where that'll become useful. This one's kind of interesting. We're looking at a mechanism to do non-key sequential read access. So just giving you sequential read access to the data partition itself, but in no particular sequence. Okay? So if you just want to read the data, all of it, very quickly, there's a way to do it. The primary use case for this is going to be on the next slide. So what we envisage doing is modifying... I thought it was on here. I guess it's not. It's just this bullet here. We're going to be modifying the select class to take advantage of that. So if you're using the select class and it does not optimize to a key read of the file, we'll be able to use the non-key sequential read to access the file extremely quickly. So when an index isn't used, we've still got a really fast way of getting to the data. And if there's no index, there's no predefined, there's no guaranteed sequence anyway, so who cares, right? So this is all looking great for really great performance out of the select class, which in turn will help tools like Harmony Core and all of your apps as well. And also another big keyword or set of words that we're working on is something called high availability. I know this is something that's extremely important to a lot of you. You know, how do we keep our systems running 24/7, 365 and so on? Yet how do we do Windows updates and how do we do backups and things like that? This is really just a teaser. Jeff's got a session on this later in the day, so we're going to be taking that as an entire topic in its own right. So some good stuff coming there. Briefly, migrating to Synergy 11. Synergy 11 does require Windows 8 or Windows Server 2012 or higher. Support has been dropped for Windows 7. Support has also been dropped for Windows Server 2008 R2. Early next year, there is no support for those operating systems. So version 11 does not support them. I believe it is true that we have not done anything to actually block them in our installs right at this point in time, but you really shouldn't be going there. And it's not formally supported. Also in the Visual Studio world, we currently support Visual Studio 2017 or later. So with Synergy 11, Visual Studio 2015 support has been dropped. And Rev 11 licensing is a requirement for Synergy version 11. So as soon as you do Synergy version 11, you will be using Rev 11 licensing and you'll be talking to our internet-based server for your keys and all of that stuff that I'll talk you through a little bit later. So it will be a slightly different procedure for doing new installations. It's a significantly simplified process for doing new installs. Requirements: in order to upgrade to version 11, we only support upgrades from version 9.3.1 or higher. So if you are on an older version of Synergy, what we'd recommend you do is update to 10.3.3 and then update again to version 11, because the version 11 will not support a direct update from anything earlier than 9.3.1. And also, if you rely on OpenSSL, again, bear in mind 1.0 is no longer supported after the end of this year, so you really need to be looking at upgrading your OpenSSL. You really need to try and get onto the current 1.1.1 release, which is the long-term support, and will set you in good stead for several years. But the important thing is, if you want to go to 1.1.1 on OpenSSL, you need to be on Synergy 11 to get support for that. Okay, and that's a typical thing. If you're doing encryption-type stuff, you really need to keep everything up to date. Synergy 11 requirements. We are building Synergy with a new version of the C and C++ runtime. There's a good chance Windows 8 or higher will have the runtime. If not, our version 11 install will install the runtime for you if you're on Windows 8 or higher. There is one possible problem. If you're using Windows 8 systems with a client-only install, which some people have done, then that new runtime needs to get onto all the client systems as well. So unfortunately, you're going to have to touch all the client systems and either go reapply the Synergy client install or go download and install the C++ runtime yourselves. Synergy 11 and Workbench, there have been no changes to the Workbench product in Synergy 11. It is still exactly as it was in 10.3.3 versions. The one change is that Workbench is no longer selected by default during the 32-bit installation. It's still included in the install. There's a checkbox there. If you're using Workbench, you just need to remember to check the box because it's not checked by default anymore. Also, by default, if you order a new development system, I think customer services are no longer shipping PSDE licenses, which are the Workbench licenses. They're shipping PSW, which supports command line and Visual Studio use. But again, it's not an entitlement change, it's just what we do by default. So if you do want Workbench, you just have to request those keys. When you request your version 11 upgrade, remember to say, I am using Workbench and I would like a Workbench key, please. And even if you forget at install, it's not a problem. You still have the right to them, so you can go back at any time and say, oh, I forgot, I need my workbench key, please. There is a current version 11 beta out there, so we've encouraged as many people as possible to download it and get involved and play with some of this new stuff. So this is just a suggested process of getting it and trying out things with it. You don't have to rebuild anything to test with the version 11 runtimes and things like that. You can install it and try out the new fconvert performance and things like that, isutil performance and all of those things. But we'd encourage you to try and rebuild your app and make use of some of the new features and play with them. Right now, if you do want to use the new features, you do have to, when you compile, tell it you want to use 11.1 runtime compatibility, because it defaults, not sure why this was done, but it defaults to 10.3.3 levels. So by default, the new capabilities are not there in the compiler unless you enable them. That will change before release. So if you try and use one of the new features and you get a not found error from the compiler or something, you just need to tell it, oh yeah, use version 11 mode. Okay, so that's my information about the Synergy product update.